The Nintendo Switch 2 is sadly failing to meet buyer expectations. This is something of a major talking point that has been around since the console launched, but it is an often debated sentiment. After all, when you consider the amount of time that the console has been out, the number of first-party and third-party games that have made it to the console, many people will rightfully point out that the library of games available for the Nintendo Switch 2 is actually fairly healthy on paper. And a very popular comment that surfaces pretty much anytime this discussion comes out is a suggestion that you, the person complaining, must have never been around for a previous console's launch. And this comment, in and of itself, is the entire issue. The reality is the Nintendo Switch 2 is the fastest selling game console in history. Or at the very least it was in its first 6 months, on a worldwide scale. But it's not only the fastest selling console across the first 6 months. Nearly half of the entirety of those buyers were within the first 7 weeks, in that opening launch window. This means that, statistically speaking, just going based off of the numbers, the Nintendo Switch 2 is actually dealing with more day one buyers, or at least early launch window buyers, than any other console has in history. So yes, there are a lot of people that are experiencing a console launch for the very first time. But it is not their fault that they feel underwhelmed by the lineup of titles that Nintendo has announced up until this point in time. Nintendo did their best to build up as much hype as they can for the launch of the Nintendo Switch 2. Part of that was extending the life of the Switch 1 for as long as possible, delaying the launch of the Nintendo Switch 2 so that they can stockpile enough units to always break records through the first year of its life, since obviously every other console through its first year was severely supply constrained. The momentous build-up towards the launch of the Nintendo Switch 2 cannot be understated. The expectations for everybody that came into this console, especially those first 6 million people that bought it in the first 7 weeks of the console's life, was that they were walking into an event, an occasion, a Nintendo generation that was going to hit the ground running. Especially because through the last 2 or 3 years of the Nintendo Switch 1's life, it halted to a very slow and painful crawl. Nintendo delivered on having the consoles available, but they were and have been unable to deliver on the software to match that initial hype. I saw a statistic the other day that it had been over 1,000 days since the launch of Tears of the Kingdom. This would effectively put us in the longest window of time from a launch of a mainline Zelda title to the announcement of its follow-up. When it comes to 3D Mario, we have not seen anything about 3D Mario, a brand new one, basically ever. Not since Odyssey launched in 2017. It's been about a half a decade since Animal Crossing came out and were treated with updates and upgrade packs, and this seems to be a pattern with all of the main franchises for the Nintendo Switch 2. The reality is, when people buy a Nintendo console, they want those mainline first-party IPs. They want the big hitters. Remember, due to the supply constraint of the Nintendo Switch 1, not that many people were able to buy it in its first 6 months. So if somebody was finally able to get a hold of one in the 5th month of the console's life, they would be able to squeeze over 400 hours into Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, and then if they were to get bored of that game, which took a very long time for most passionate gamers to get through, they then could immediately shift over to Mario Odyssey, which on the lower end would also give people 30 to 40 hours plus of game time. When it comes to the Nintendo Switch 2, the only exclusive titles that have mainline appeal have effectively been Mario Kart World and Donkey Kong Bonanza. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe was there on the Nintendo Switch, so the value of Mario Kart World basically cancels out with that title. Donkey Kong Bonanza just could not live up to what neither Breath of the Wild or Mario Odyssey provided. In fact, the average person probably spent about half of the time on Bonanza as they did on either of those other two titles. And even then, we're looking at a release date for Bonanza that was back in July. Back then, there were already 6 million buyers of the Switch 2. So we're approaching almost half a year without another mainline game that's not considered a niche spin-off or a relatively low-performing franchise. As far as first parties are concerned, Nintendo has completely let down their fandom in the first year of the Switch's life. But they've only let it down with the hype and the expectation that they themselves set for the console prior to its launch. And obviously, a very large issue with this whole Switch 2 situation is the third-party games. Third parties have been an issue with Nintendo for a very long time. The Nintendo Switch 2, in essence, was marketed as a much stronger console specifically to appeal to people that are looking for third-party titles on the go. Many people bought into this console expecting higher performance because Nintendo advertised a device that goes up to 120 frames per second and supports up to 4K. Instead, it just feels like business as usual. You are getting a significantly more inferior port of a game that would otherwise play better anywhere else, including for the most part on rival handheld devices like the Steam Deck or another handheld gaming PC. FIFA, Madden, Star Wars Outlaws, Final Fantasy VII. These are old titles that have a dramatic drop-off in comparison to the counterpart where you can play on your other device. And while there are many people that only have a single console, there are equally, if not more people out in the industry that do have something in addition to the Switch 2 to play these games on. Because as the old adage goes, people buy Nintendo for the first-party games. It is not a third-party device. But leading up to the launch of the console, Nintendo was able to fool people into thinking that these third-party performances would be close enough to the real deal, where it would become worth it for buyers. But they've under-delivered, and the sales patterns have shown it for months now. The software sales are low, and especially the third-party software sales are very low, outside of a few breakouts. To put something into perspective, Final Fantasy VII Remake just recently came out. It's sold out everywhere. Everybody's talking about how great it's doing on the console. Everybody's talking about how the Switch 2 is going to be the major third-party handheld device that everybody uses now for these AAA titles. And while Final Fantasy VII has had a good launch for an old port, an old inferior port at that, putting things into perspective, it sold almost as many units in its opening week in Japan as a Switch 2 edition of Mario Party Jamboree. And it did so with almost double the user base that Mario Party Jamboree had when it launched. If you assume similar patterns on a worldwide scale, effectively, one of the most popular games in history, at only $40, had a launch that was comparable to an $80 port of a Mario Party title from last gen. It's not because Mario Party was selling well. It's because the expectation for third-party games on this console are significantly lower than anybody has. So when something like Final Fantasy does well, the definition of well or good or overperforming is not scrutinized to the extent it needs to be. The issue is when third-party games come over to the Nintendo console, they very much feel like ports from something that belongs elsewhere. If you ask a random person around the world which console they associate EAFC with, or FIFA, you know, just one of the best-selling games of all time in the entire world, and every single year it's always topping charts, where do they play it? Which console do they associate it with? Almost 100% of the time, they will tell you their PlayStation 5. And if it's not the PlayStation 5, it's probably the PS4. People like to laugh at Sony during the PlayStation 5 generation because they say that it has no games, it has no exclusives. And that's generally a defense that people will make for the Nintendo Switch 2, and they will bring up the exclusives that it has versus the other consoles. What they failed to realize is that for the average person, those third-party games are what got them to buy the PS5 in the first place, including the free-to-play titles. Rocket League, for example, just recently hit 1 million concurrent users ever since it switched to free-to-play. This is the first time since the pandemic in 2020 where there are more than 1 million people playing the game at the same time. And according to the data, nearly half of that 1 million was on the PlayStation console. And that's generous. This is not even a very console-heavy game. This is very popular amongst PC users. The PC user base is obsessed with Rocket League, and even then, it's only a quarter of the player base playing this game. Steam doesn't even provide Rocket League anymore, and even from that, roughly the same number of people are playing it on the discontinued Steam version in comparison to those that are playing it on Nintendo consoles. And I only bring up Rocket League because it's a most recent data point, and it's something that would actually favor fewer PlayStation consoles than most other games. Fortnite, COD, Madden, NBA, and then you talk about upcoming AAA titles that will be released, eventually Grand Theft Auto. All of those big-name third-party titles, while they are not PlayStation exclusives, these are system sellers for the PlayStation. So the reality is, you can show me as many charts as you want of Nintendo having more exclusives in its first launch year for the Switch 2 in comparison to the other devices out there. But what people are failing to address is Nintendo consoles need the first-party games in order to thrive. These are the reasons people buy Nintendo consoles, and they are the reason that most people went out and grabbed a Nintendo Switch 2. The issue is Nintendo has been hyper-focused on third-party games, because obviously that's generated revenue for them when people are buying it on their consoles, and it's effectively revenue that Nintendo gets without having to go through the hassle and the headaches and the cost of creating a first-party title for their fandom. This is a very big reason why, despite not having many first-party PlayStation games this generation, Sony is still succeeding like crazy because, like I said, most people associate these third-party titles with the PlayStation console even if they are available elsewhere. And obviously it's the complete opposite for the Switch 2. And Nintendo is trying to change that. They want to be able to get that money without making the games. But the problem is most games that are coming in are old ports that are available elsewhere. Even if a game was to launch on the same day and date with the Switch 2 as it does on PC and the PlayStation 5, and even the Xbox Series X will be competitive on this. Remember, a 30+ million user base doesn't just magically disappear overnight. Even if the ports are no longer old ports coming into the console, they are still completely inferior compared to everything else you can play it on. And while the portability will make it appealing for some, it won't make it appealing for everybody. And that is especially because the Switch 2 is not that portable either. It's a very big device with a terrible battery life. So there is a benefit for the portability, but it's not nearly as high as you would expect for these major AAA third-party titles that are launching across multiple devices. According to the latest rumors, Nintendo's next Direct is going to be a third-party partner showcase. This is not what Nintendo Switch 2 buyers want. There will be a small portion of people pretending it's what people that have a Nintendo Switch 2 bought, and an even smaller portion of those people that are genuinely excited to see what third-party games are coming to the Switch 2. But this is as small of a subset of a population as you can get for a Nintendo console. Rightfully, this has created concern for many people, because if the partner showcase is going to be in February, you could very easily be looking at April or maybe even June until you see an announcement of another Direct for first-party titles for the Nintendo console. Which also could imply that for many Switch 2 buyers, they will have bought Bananza in July and then didn't play another game on that console, maybe not even booted it up, until over a year later. And that's only if a big hitter actually gets announced whenever that next Direct comes by. Because we could be waiting even longer for Nintendo to put out a first-party title if they spend too much time focusing on third-party splits in order to please their shareholders. Because obviously that's what it's all about on the end of the day. Historically, Nintendo used to have a president named Satoru Iwata. He was a gamer first. Now, he was still a CEO of a corporation. There's no need to overglaze him. But the way that he was able to bring so many people into the fandom and into the Nintendo atmosphere was focusing on the games first. Nowadays, according to a former Nintendo employee, after Iwata-san passed away, which happened back in 2015 sadly, it's very focused on the money. Iwata was adamant that their core philosophy should be on the game, not on the money. Now it's almost entirely on the money, which does worry me a bit. This quote was taken from a Eurogamer article in 2018. Corporations are never your friend. The bottom line is always the money, but the routes they take to make that money often can make the experience more appealing for gamers. And in the case of the Nintendo Switch 2, with the focus being primarily on the money, on the hope that they can get by through an entire console generation by making fewer games, hoping that third parties can pick up the slack, drip-feeding the releases of not only every major first-party game, but also drip-feeding the announcements to bring out those games to generate headlines and hype, while also drip-feeding the upgrades from the Switch 1 titles to the Switch 2, which most people were under the impression would be ready on day one, and all the while also drip-feeding the release of their classic titles on their subscription model, even though every single one of those classic games is ready as a ROM today, now, and they can just put it all up on there for fans to enjoy. The primary focus for Nintendo is on the ability to make money without spending money. There are no risks to be taken from this company anymore, and the risks are what often led to some of the best experiences any Nintendo gamer has ever had. They've been met with financial failures, sure, but they've more than made up for the losses that they saw on the Wii U days, and they made sure that every single one of those games that failed on the Wii U made some type of an appearance on the Nintendo Switch 1 in the following generation, either through a direct port or a sequel built off of that engine. They've more than recuperated their losses. They were able to pad out the Nintendo Switch 1's life, especially its early life, by re-releasing old games at full price and making a lot of money on it because they sold significantly more copies than they could imagine. But for the user base that was buying the Switch 1, they didn't view those as Wii U titles because very few people actually bought the Wii U. These were considered new games, new experiences. Whereas with the Nintendo Switch 2, they're trying to shift that into upgrade packs. The problem is an upgrade pack, which at best might give you a few hours of additional content, won't be able to hold the attention of gamers nearly as much as those Wii U ports did. So while Nintendo is able to scrape in an additional $20 here and there from the people that are willing to upgrade these Switch 2 versions, it leaves the gamers starving for more, for a reason to play their console. Not everybody wants to just play a last-gen game with some additional upgrades. Not everybody wants to just play a last-gen game with a better performance. Historically, Nintendo fans do not care about performances of their titles, resolutions and frame rates and the like. That's why there are so many people that are happy about inferior ports that have come to the Nintendo Switch 2. So for those people that don't care about an additional DLC that'll give you a couple hours of game time, and aren't too bothered by a slight upres and maybe a quicker frame rate, they are still left waiting for Nintendo to release the first-party titles that they bought the console for. Or at the very least, to let people know that those games are coming and when they are coming. The lack of communication between Nintendo and the fandom is perhaps one of the biggest losses that we've seen in the past console generation. And this has obviously largely happened because you substituted faces that enjoyed interacting with their audiences, faces like Reggie Filsaime and the deceased Satoru Iwata, with nothing but corporate figureheads that are afraid of cameras. And those corporate heads did not bother to hire somebody that is willing to face the audience and deliver the messages that need to be sent out, and make the promises of the titles and the games that people are looking for. Nintendo used to approach their customer base as if they were their friend, equally as excited for the games that they were going to play as Nintendo was to make those games. This is the reason why there was always so much affinity between the fandom and the corporation that was making the games. But now Nintendo has largely banked on the expectations that people have for this console. If back in April, Nintendo was clear about the games that were coming out from then until March, I'd wager that more people would have gladly waited to buy the console. And likewise, if they were to come out now and say that the new 3D Mario title was not coming out for another 2 years, or that you wouldn't get a Smash Brothers for another 2.5 years, or that Zelda might not come out till the end of next year, the reason they won't do that is because they know that when they put a time limit on it, now people start to think, oh, I can just wait and buy it later. Instead, with this lack of communication, they continue to thrive and build up an immense amount of hype for this game console. They allow speculation to take the reins. They allow message boards and YouTubers and media outlets. They let them gaslight so many people into thinking that the next big first-party title is coming. And it puts people in a position where, in their minds, they're buying a Switch 2 because they're about to get a plethora of Nintendo first-party titles, even though some of the ones that they're actually buying it for might not be coming out for another 2 or 3 years minimum. And this manufactured hype, this intentional lack of communication, this reliance on headlines, reliance on gaslighting, reliance on people's emotions, while it led to the Switch 2 having the fastest 7 months in history, it also led to the Nintendo Switch 2 being the fastest console to make people question their purchase, to make people wonder if it was actually worth it. They have their devices sitting on shelves collecting dust. They have buyer's remorse. They are regretting their purchase. There has never been a larger rise up in hype for the release of almost anything in video gaming history as the Switch 2 has had. And because that hype was all manufactured based off of effectively nothing, there has equally never been as massive of a drop-off in interest in a brand new console as there has been with the Nintendo Switch 2. And the fact that this upcoming Nintendo Direct is going to be a third-party Direct means all of that hype will just simply continue to dwindle away.